It was an October night in 2002. Troy Taylor, a paranormal investigator who describes himself as psychic as a fence post, was walking down the darkened corridor on the fourth floor of Waverly Hills Sanitarium. What he saw that night would make him question everything he thought he knew about reality. In front of him, about 20 meters away, a completely solid human figure walked down the corridor. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't transparent. It was as real as any living person. When the figure entered a room, Troy ran after it. The room had only one entrance. There were no windows. There was no other way out. The room was completely empty. Welcome to Waverly Hills, where more than 8,000 people died seeking a cure. Where, according to legend, one person died every hour at the height of the epidemic. And where, decades after its closure, thousands of witnesses swear the patients never left. On the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky, stands one of America's most haunting buildings, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium. 5 stories of Gothic architecture built atop one of the highest hills in Jefferson County. Officially opened on October 17, 1926, Waverly Hills wasn't a prison. It wasn't an asylum for the insane. It was a hospital, a place of hope where thousands of people came seeking a cure for the deadliest disease of its time, tuberculosis. But something went terribly wrong. What was meant to be a healing sanctuary became a palace of death. And today, nearly 65 years after its closure, Waverly Hills is considered one of the most haunted places in the world. It has been investigated by more than 40 international television programs. Thousands of people have reported experiences they can't explain. Skeptical investigators have captured on camera things that defy all logic. But before we talk about ghosts, we need to understand what really happened here. Because the true story of Waverly Hills is far more terrifying than any ghost legend. To understand Waverly Hills, we have to travel to Louisville, Kentucky in 1900. At the time, Louisville had a deadly problem. It had one of the highest tuberculosis death rates in the United States. Why Louisville? Geography conspired against it. The city is located in the Ohio Valley, surrounded by swampy lands that impeded the flow of fresh air. Industrial pollution from factories and overcrowded communities created the perfect breeding ground for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Tuberculosis wasn't just any disease. It was known as the White Death, or the White Plague, because of the deathly pallor it gave its victims. It was also called consumption because it literally consumed people from within. Imagine this, a cough that never goes away, a fever that weakens you day after day, chest pain that makes it impossible to breathe, and finally coughing up blood. More and more blood, until your lungs just stop working. At the height of the epidemic, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in most industrialized nations. In Kentucky, the situation was particularly desperate due to a lack of public health funding and limited medical resources. The disease didn't discriminate. It struck rich and poor, young and old, men and women. Entire families were devastated. And worst of all, it was highly contagious. In 1906, the Louisville Anti-Tuberculosis Association said, "Enough is enough." They formed the Tuberculosis Hospital Board with an ambitious mission to build a sophisticated, modern treatment center that could save lives. They carefully chose the location, a high hill in southern Jefferson County, away from the city's pollution, with peaceful panoramic views and, most importantly, fresh airflow at the heights. The place was called Waverly Hills. At the time, no one could have imagined that this name would become synonymous with terror. On July 26, 1910, the first Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened, a small, 2-story wooden building designed for 40 to 50 patients. But the epidemic didn't stop. Every year, more and more patients arrived. The small wooden building soon became completely inadequate. In March 1924, construction began on something far more ambitious, a massive 5-story building with Gothic architecture capable of accommodating up to 400 patients simultaneously. Construction took 2.5 years. When it finally opened on October 17, 1926, Waverly Hills was considered one of the most advanced and modern sanatoriums in America. It had everything that medical science of the time considered essential: wide open spaces, balconies for patients to get fresh air, abundant sunlight streaming in through giant windows, and a dedicated medical staff on staff around the clock. It was a palace of hope, but there was a problem. In 1926, there was still no cure for tuberculosis. So, what were the doctors doing in Waverly Hills? What they could. And sometimes, what they thought might work, even if it was brutal. The main treatment was called heliotherapy, exposure to fresh air and sunlight. Patients would spend hours, even in winter, lying on open balconies, breathing in the cold air, in the belief that this would strengthen their lungs. Imagine having a high fever, coughing up blood, and being put outside when it's snowing. But that was the least invasive. When heliotherapy didn't work, doctors resorted to more drastic procedures. Thoracoplasty, surgically removing ribs to collapse the diseased lung, in the hope that this would stop the spread of infection. Pneumothorax, inserting needles between the ribs to pump air or gas into the chest cavity, artificially collapsing the lung. These procedures were performed without modern anesthesia, often with nothing more than basic morphine for pain relief. And they didn't work. Not really. Month after month, year after year, the patients kept coming. And month after month, year after year, they kept dying. Nurses who worked there during its operational years told stories of ghostly patients and unexplained noises even then, decades before it became famous for being haunted.
Why?
Because Waverly Hills was becoming something its founders never imagined. It wasn't a hospital. It was a warehouse of death. According to conservative estimates by local historians, approximately 8,000 people died within the walls of Waverly Hills between 1910 and 1961. Legend speaks of a much higher number, more than 63,000 deaths. Medical records that might confirm the exact figure were destroyed in the Great Flood of 1937, and later documentation was carelessly discarded when the hospital closed. We will never know the real number. But what we do know is this: at the height of the epidemic, one person was said to be dying every hour in Waverly Hills. One death. Every hour. Every day. For years. And that's when it appeared, the tunnel. 500-foot-long tunnel, approximately 150 meters, that descends from the main building at Waverly Hills to the base of the hill. Officially, it was called the Supply Tunnel System. Doctors said it was built to transport food, medical supplies, and personnel during the winter, when the weather made climbing the hill difficult. But the workers who were there will tell you something else. They call it the Tunnel of Death. Or the Body Chute. Because that tunnel had another purpose. A purpose the hospital administrators wanted to keep secret. Think about it. When you have hundreds of patients dying, when families are visiting their sick loved ones, when new patients arrive with hope, you can't let them see the dead bodies. You can't have hearses pulling up through the main entrance every few hours. It would be devastating for morale. Then the bodies went down the tunnel. Motorized rail system. Bodies were placed on wheeled stretchers and sent rolling down the endless passage in the darkness to the lower entrance, where funeral vehicles waited out of sight. The workers who had to do this work reported inexplicable sensations even then. A presence. A feeling of being watched. The feeling that something was following them in the darkness. Most paranormally active places in all of Waverly Hills. Researchers report sounds of objects being dragged through the tunnel. Physical pushes from invisible forces. The feeling of hands touching visitors. Doors that close by themselves, trapping people inside. Tina Mattinglys, the building's current owner, has confirmed that multiple people, including herself, have been inexplicably locked inside the body chute over the years. The doors do not have self-closing mechanisms. Finally, in 1943, something changed. A scientist named Selman Waxman discovered streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against tuberculosis. For the first time in human history, tuberculosis was curable. Sanitariums like Waverly Hills began to empty. Patients who would have died a decade ago were now recovering and returning home to their families. It was a medical miracle. By 1961, Waverly Hills was no longer needed. On June 8th of that year, it officially closed its doors as a tuberculosis sanatorium. The Age of Terror was over, or so they thought. In 1962, the building reopened under a new name, Woodhaven Medical Services, a nursing home and geriatric hospital. But something was deeply wrong. Over the next 18 years, disturbing reports emerged: mistreated elderly patients, unsanitary conditions, allegations of abuse and neglect. By 1980, the state of Kentucky had had enough. Woodhaven was closed by state order, and Waverly Hills was completely abandoned, empty, in silence. Or at least, that's what everyone assumed. For more than 20 years, Waverly Hills remained empty. The building changed hands several times. Different owners had ambitious plans to convert it into luxury condominiums, an office complex, or a shopping center. None of the plans materialized. The building was deteriorating. The windows were breaking. Rain was pouring in. Vegetation was beginning to reclaim the hallways. And something else began to happen. Local youths discovered they could easily break in. Waverly Hills became a popular destination for thrill-seeking trespassers. They came in at night with lanterns, and they ran away, terrified, swearing they would never return. The stories began. A group of teenagers hear children's voices singing in an empty wing. A couple explores the fourth floor and sees a shadowy figure cross the corridor ahead of them. A man enters the body chute on a dare and comes out with scratches on his back that weren't there when he walked in. By the late 1990s, Waverly Hills had a local reputation as the most haunted place in Kentucky. But he was still relatively unknown outside the area. That was about to change. In July 2001, a couple named Charlie and Tina Mattinglys did something that many considered crazy. They purchased the Waverly Hills Sanatorium for $230,000. The building was in ruins. The city planned to completely demolish it and build something new in its place. Charlie and Tina said, "No, this place is important. It has history. It needs to be preserved." Charlie had a personal connection to Waverly Hills. His father had worked there as an orderly for 4 years when it operated as a tuberculosis hospital. "I knew the stories. I knew the history. And also, I knew the ghost legends." The Mattinglys made a decision. They would open Waverly Hills to the public. Historical day tours. And, to finance the restoration, paranormal tours at night. Also in July 2001, something else happened. A television production company called Triage Entertainment, behind the Fox show Scariest Places on Earth, decided to film an episode in Waverly Hills. They asked the Louisville Ghost Hunters Society to participate as guides and historians. The episode aired nationally, and suddenly the whole country knew about Waverly Hills. Paranormal forums exploded. Ghost hunters from across the United States added Waverly Hills to their must-see lists. The program, Scariest Places on Earth, ranked it as the second scariest place on the planet. The modern era of Waverly Hills had begun. And with it would come the investigations that would capture on camera things that no one could explain. 2006, the Sci-Fi Channel show Ghost Hunters, hosted by Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson of TAPS, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, came to Waverly Hills for an in-depth investigation. TAPS was different from many other paranormal teams. Their approach was skeptical. They came in trying to debunk paranormal activity, seeking rational explanations for each phenomenon. If they couldn't find an explanation, then, and only then, did they consider the possibility of something genuinely paranormal. That night in Waverly Hills, they captured something that left them speechless. Using infrared cameras in a sealed hallway where there were no visitors, the cameras captured what appeared to be a full-body shadow figure walking out of a door. The silhouette moved with purpose. It wasn't a blur or a technical anomaly. It was a completely black, featureless shape that seemed to block out the light as it crossed the corridor. And then, he quickly stepped back into the room. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, who had investigated hundreds of locations, described it as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence they had captured in their entire careers. But there was another experience, perhaps even more shocking, that happened a few years earlier. 2002, paranormal investigator Troy Taylor, author of multiple books on unexplained phenomena, visited Waverly Hills. Troy describes himself as psychic as a fence post. He's a skeptic by nature, analytical, and not someone who feels presences or has mystical experiences. But that night on the 4th floor of Waverly Hills, he saw something that changed his perspective forever. I was exploring with a friend. The corridor was empty, lit only by their flashlights. In front of them, about 20 meters away, a human figure appeared walking down the corridor. It wasn't transparent. It wasn't a shadow. It was solid, as real as any living person. Troy screamed, thinking someone else had entered the apartment without authorization. The figure entered one of the rooms. Troy ran after her, with his friend following him. They entered the room. Empty. Completely empty. The room had only one entrance. There were no windows. There was no other way out. It was impossible for anyone to have escaped. Troy Taylor, the skeptic, later wrote, "There's no doubt about what I saw at Waverly Hills Sanatorium in 2002. I saw a ghost. After taps, many more came. Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures. Kindred Spirits with Amy Bruni and Adam Berry. Destination America's Paranormal Lockdown. Destination Fear. More than 40 international programs have filmed in Waverly Hills. And almost all of them have captured something inexplicable. Photographs showing orbs, luminous spheres, not visible to the human eye. Mists or vapors that take humanoid forms. Shadow figures that were not visible during the actual investigation, but appear clearly in the photographs. And then there's the most disturbing evidence of all, audio recordings. Paranormal investigators use a technique called EVP, electronic voice phenomena. It works like this. You leave a digital recorder running in an empty room. Sometimes you ask questions out loud. Then you play the recording back and listen carefully. In most places, you won't capture anything, just silence. But in Waverly Hills, they capture voices. Particularly in room 502 and the Tunnel of Death, researchers have recorded what they say are whispers, entire conversations, and direct answers to questions. The most disturbing thing, these voices weren't audible during the investigation. They only appear when you play back the recordings. A researcher recorded on the 2nd floor and later, during playback, described, "I kept feeling like I was being followed, with footsteps all around me, but I couldn't track them. I didn't hear the voice at the time, only later during the playback." Another researcher on the 3rd floor, "I heard a cough. It was a child's cough. It broke my heart. I've worked in healthcare and hospice and I know these coughs. They'll tear you apart. I've never experienced anything like this in the paranormal field." But it's not just the recordings. Thousands of visitors, professional researchers, casual tourists, avowed skeptics, report physical experiences they cannot explain. Feeling like invisible forces are pulling your hair. The overwhelming feeling of being watched in empty rooms. Pushes that make them stagger. Touching their shoulders when no one is around. And then there are the scratches. Multiple visitors have left Waverly Hills with scratch marks on their skin, red scratches that definitely weren't there when they entered. They have no explanation as to how they got there. Is all this real? Or are there rational explanations? Let's examine both sides. Let's first talk about the arguments for Waverly Hills being genuinely haunted. Argument number 1. The volume of suffering. At least 8,000 people died within these walls. At the height of the epidemic, one death every hour. decades of agony, patients coughing blood, undergoing brutal surgeries without adequate anesthesia, dying alone, far from their families. If any place on Earth could be impregnated with the residual energy of trauma and death, it would be this one. Argument number 2. Consistency of the reports. Thousands of visitors over more than 20 years report remarkably similar experiences. Activity concentrated in the same locations, room 502, 4th floor, body chute. Meetings with the same entities, children, nurses, the rastrero. The same types of phenomena, shadow figures, voices, physical touches. If it were all suggestion or imagination, why is there so much consistency among groups that don't know each other? Argument number 3. Evidence captured by skeptics. Troy Taylor is not a medium. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson of TAPS actively seek to debunk paranormal activity. However, they also captured evidence that they could not explain. Now, the other side. Explanation number 1. The building itself. Waverly Hills is in ruins, and the decaying buildings produce many natural phenomena that can seem paranormal. Wind tunnel system. The extensive corridors act as wind tunnels, causing unexpected air currents and sudden temperature changes that can seem like supernatural presences. Structural settlement. The building is constantly sinking and shifting, creating bangs, creaks, and footsteps that may sound like intentional communication. Old electrical systems. Old electrical wires and plumbing generate electromagnetic fluctuations that trigger the EMF meters used by paranormal investigators, causing false positives. Explanation number 2. Power of suggestion. Here's the problem. Almost everyone who visits Waverly Hills already knows it's the most haunted place in the world. They arrive expecting to see ghosts. This activates several powerful psychological biases. Pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see patterns where none exist. A random shadow becomes a shape. A random creak becomes a voice. Confirmation bias. If you believe a place is haunted, your brain searches for and finds evidence that confirms that belief, while ignoring mundane explanations. Emotional contagion. In groups, people reinforce each other's experiences. If one person says, "I feel something," others immediately begin to feel it too. Explanation number 3. Technical problems. Those orbs in photographs that look like spirits? They could be dust particles, moisture, or reflections from the camera's flash. Mysterious fogs? They are often condensation of breath in cold air. Anomalous EMF readings? They can be caused by cell phones, camera equipment, and other electronic devices that researchers carry with them. And then there's the most uncomfortable factor of all. Explanation number 4. Economic incentive. Charlie and Tina Mattinglys earn a substantial income from paranormal tours. Private investigations cost a minimum of $1,000 per group. Their Halloween haunted house generates crucial restoration funds. Do they have an incentive to keep the legend alive that Waverly Hills is haunted? Absolutely. Does that mean they are fabricating evidence or lying? Not necessarily. But it's a conflict of interest we must take into account. We need to talk about room 502. If you ask any paranormal enthusiast about Waverly Hills, they'll tell you, room 502 is where the darkest stories are. The legend says this. In 1928, a young nurse named Mary Hillenberg worked on the 5th floor of Waverly Hills. She became pregnant out of wedlock, a devastating scandal at the time. Desperate, she hanged herself in room 502, hanging from the ceiling light. A few years later, another nurse working in the same room jumped from the window, falling to the 2nd floor roof, and dying instantly. Both women are said to still haunt room 502, trapped in the place where their lives ended in tragedy. It's a powerful story. Tragic. Memorable. There's just one problem. There is absolutely no evidence that this ever happened. Researchers have exhaustively searched for Kentucky death records. Only 2 people with the surname Hillenberg have died in Kentucky. Both died significantly later than the rumored date, and well after Waverly Hills closed. Local press records: there are no newspaper articles about nurse suicides in Waverly Hills during the 1920s or 1930s. Ghost Hunters Research: they conducted archival research specifically looking for these deaths. They found nothing. Local researchers: several Louisville historians have attempted to verify the story. None have found any documentation. So where did the story come from? It probably started as a local urban legend. Someone who worked there vaguely remembered something that might have happened. Over time, details were added, embellished, and became more specific. By the time Waverly Hills became famous, Mary Hillenberg's story was common knowledge, but common knowledge doesn't mean true. A former employee at the facility appears to corroborate that something happened in that room. But the specific details, the names, the dates, the exact circumstances, remain unverified. And this brings us to an awkward question. If Waverly Hills' most famous story can't be verified, what else we know about this place is legend rather than fact. But here's the strange thing. Even if the story isn't true, Room 502 is still the place where the most paranormal activity is reported. Researchers unfamiliar with the legend enter that room and report feeling deeply uncomfortable. Recorders capture EVPs there more frequently than anywhere else. Visitors leave with an overwhelming sense of sadness and despair. So, what does that mean? Is there really something paranormal in that room that inspired the legend? Or is the legend so powerful that it creates the psychological expectation that produces the experiences? We don't know. And that's honestly the most honest answer I can give you. Over the years, certain spirits have been repeatedly identified by different researchers on different occasions. They're consistent. They have personalities. They have stories. Let me introduce you to the residents of Waverly Hills. Timmy. The most famous is a boy named Timmy. According to investigators, Timmy lived in the children's ward while his parents were treated for stage 3 tuberculosis on other floors. One day, Timmy was playing on the roof of the building and fell, dying instantly. Researchers say Timmy is playful. He enjoys interacting with visitors. If you leave a ball in the hallway of the children's ward, sometimes it rolls away. Multiple investigators have reported hearing children laughing and small footsteps running through empty hallways. Is Timmy real? Did a boy named Timmy really die in Waverly Hills? Without medical records, we cannot verify this. But the consistency of the reports about this childlike spirit is disturbing. The creeper. This entity is completely different. She's not playful. She's not sad. She's malevolent. Witnesses describe the rastrero as a dark shadow figure that crawls, literally crawls, not walks, along the walls, ceilings, and floors of the 4th floor. It moves in ways that defy gravity. Up the walls, across the ceiling, crawling like a giant spider. Those who have had close encounters with the creeper report a suffocating feeling of absolute terror. Not just fear, existential dread. One researcher described his experience on the 4th floor. It wasn't physical with me, although, at one point during my time on that floor, I did have a horrible stomach ache. Another researcher experienced this as well, but we were in 2 separate groups and on the floor at 2 separate times. He stalked us down the hallway, and just before we left the apartment, another member and I heard him coming running down the hallway behind us. He got so close to us that I stopped and braced myself to be grabbed or knocked down. It didn't affect either of us. What is the rastrero? Nobody knows. Some speculate that it could be a manifestation of all the suffering concentrated on that floor. Others believe it's something older, something that was there before the hospital was built. The nurse. And then there's her. The nameless nurse from room 502. Even if their story cannot be verified, their presence is constantly reported. A female figure in a vintage nurse's uniform, seen by multiple witnesses who do not know each other. Sometimes he's crying. Sometimes he's just standing there staring out the window. Researchers Amy Bruni and Adam Berry of the Kindred Spirits program made contact with what they believed to be the spirit of a nurse during their investigation. Amy later said that the experience was so powerful and undeniable that it directly inspired the creation of her own paranormal investigation show. This is from professional researchers who have visited hundreds of locations. John. On the 4th floor, there is another identified entity, a man named John. According to mediums who claim to have made contact with him, John was a tuberculosis patient. While he was in Waverly Hills, his wife was murdered by the man with whom she was having an affair. Unable to care for her children from the hospital, they became wards of the state. John died in Waverly Hills, alone, without family, emotionally destroyed. John is said to still walk around the 4th floor, searching for his lost family. Now, let's be clear, these stories can't be verified. There are no records of a patient named John with that specific story. They could be completely fabricated. They could be generalizations of multiple real stories combined into one. Or they could be real. We just don't know. And that we don't know is what makes Waverly Hills so fascinating and so frustrating. Waverly Hills has become much more than an abandoned building. It is a cultural phenomenon. He has appeared on more than 40 international television programs. It attracts thousands of visitors every year from all continents. It is considered one of the most haunted places in the world by virtually every major paranormal publication.
But why?
Why does this particular place capture our imagination in this way? There are many abandoned hospitals, many places where people died. So, what makes Waverly Hills special? I think it's a combination of factors. 1. The true story is genuinely terrifying. You don't need to believe in ghosts to feel chills about what really happened here. 8,000 deaths. Brutal surgeries. The body chute. The desperation of patients knowing they were likely to die. The historical truth is horrible enough in itself. 2. Gothic architecture. The building appears haunted. 5 floors of decaying Gothic architecture, slowly deteriorating, with endless corridors and deep shadows. Even skeptics admit, being there at night is unsettling. 3. The volume of testimonies. It's not just a few witnesses. It's thousands, across decades, reporting consistent experiences. That's hard to ignore, even for skeptics. 4. Preservation. Unlike many haunted buildings that have been demolished or completely renovated, Waverly Hills is frozen in time. When you walk in, you can still see the old medical equipment, the graffiti from decades of intruders, the natural deterioration. You feel the history in every room. Today, Waverly Hills operates as a full-time tourism business. Daytime historical tours of approximately 2 hours. Learn about the real history of tuberculosis and the Sanatorium. Paranormal night tours of approximately 2 hours. Visit the most active locations with experienced guides. 8-hour private investigations. Groups can explore freely with their own equipment for a minimum of $1,000. And every Halloween, they operate a professional haunted house that generates funds for the building's ongoing restoration. Charlie and Tina Mattinglys have dedicated more than 20 years of their lives to this place. They've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in stabilizing the building, replacing windows, and repairing the roof. Without paranormal tourism, Waverly Hills would probably have been demolished long ago. So there's an interesting irony here. The ghosts are saving the building. Real or not, the legend that Waverly Hills is haunted is what is preserving an important historical site. But not everything has been positive. Since 2020, there's been an ongoing legal battle between Charlie and Tina Mattinglys and the Waverly Hills Historical Society. The accusations have included misuse of funds intended for restoration, IRS investigation into finances, disputes over how the historic site should be managed, conflicts over the commercialization of the paranormal aspect versus historical preservation. The Historical Society argues that Waverly Hills should be treated primarily as an educational historical site, not a commercial paranormal attraction. The Mattinglys respond that without the income from paranormal tourism, there would be no money to restore or maintain the building at all. It's a complicated question with no easy answers. And then there's the broader debate in the paranormal community. Is Waverly Hills genuinely haunted? Or is it the perfect example of how urban legends and the power of suggestion can create paranormal experiences where none exist? Believers point out the volume and consistency of testimonies. Evidence captured by experienced investigators. Experiences of skeptics who changed their minds. Skeptics point out the lack of verification for the most famous stories. Natural explanations for most phenomena. The economic incentive to maintain a haunted reputation. Who is right? Honestly, maybe both. I've spent hours researching this case. I've read hundreds of testimonies. I've examined the evidence. I've considered skeptical explanations. And here is my conclusion. I don't know what's going on in Waverly Hills. And I think that honesty is important. What I do know is this. I know that more than 8,000 people died in that building. That's a verifiable fact. I know they died in horrible, painful ways, often alone and terrified. I know that thousands of contemporary visitors have had experiences that they consider inexplicable. I know that even professional skeptical researchers have captured evidence that they cannot easily explain. Does that mean there are ghosts? Not necessarily. It could be that the mass suffering left some kind of energetic imprint that sensitive people can detect. It could be that the building creates perfect conditions for the power of suggestion. It could be that there are aspects of consciousness and reality that we simply don't understand yet. Or it could be that the dead of Waverly Hills never really left. There is something deeply human in our fascination with places like Waverly Hills. I think it's because they force us to confront questions we normally avoid. What happens when we die? Can suffering leave a permanent mark on the physical world? Are there aspects of reality that exist beyond what our scientific instruments can measure? Or are our minds so powerful that they can create experiences that feel completely real? I don't have definitive answers. And anyone who tells you they do is probably lying or selling you something. What Waverly Hills definitely offers us is a lesson in history. It reminds us of a time not so long ago when diseases that we can easily cure today with antibiotics were death sentences. It reminds us of the suffering of thousands of people whose individual stories have been lost, but whose collective suffering still resonates in those empty corridors. It reminds us that modern medicine is a recent miracle and that our ancestors faced horrors we can barely imagine. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us that there are mysteries in this universe that we have yet to solve. That for all we know, there is much more we don't know. And it's okay to say, I don't know. So, is Waverly Hills haunted? I invite you to decide. I've presented the verifiable historical facts. I've shown the evidence that has been captured. I've offered skeptical explanations. Now it's your turn to evaluate the evidence and come to your own conclusion. If you live near Louisville, Kentucky, or plan to visit, Waverly Hills is open for tours. You can experience it for yourself. If you go, I recommend taking both tours. The daytime historical tour to understand the true story, and then, if you're feeling brave, the nighttime paranormal tour. Just if you decide to explore the body chute, make sure someone is waiting for you outside. You don't want to be locked in there alone. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into one of the most mysterious places in America. If you enjoyed this video, please help me continue creating content like this by leaving a like. And if you want more in-depth investigations of unexplained phenomena, subscribe and click the bell. In the comments, let me know. Do you think Waverly Hills is haunted? Or do you think there are rational explanations for everything? I would love to hear your opinion. And if you know of any other fascinating cases I should investigate, let me know as well. See you in the next episode. Until then, keep an open mind, but think critically.